Imagine walking into a bank you partially own, only to be humiliated by the manager who refuses to cash your check, questioning your legitimacy. Now picture the look on his face when he learns you're not just a client, you're the largest shareholder of the bank. What happens next is a powerful story of justice, leadership, and systemic change that will leave you inspired and thinking twice about the dangers of bias. This is a moment where calm composure confronts prejudice and transforms an institution. Stay with us as we unravel this incredible tale. Here in the United States, the law is equal for everyone, no matter your community, race, or religion. Diversity is what makes America strong, and unity is our greatest power. We stand together, respecting one another and sharing a deep love for our country. Patriotism is not just about flags or borders, it's about embracing every individual who calls this land home. In the USA, injustice has no place. Together we uphold justice, equality, and the shared dream of freedom. We love the USA, and the USA loves all of us. Comments below where you're watching from, and if you like and love our story, kindly subscribe our channel. Life, inspirational, and motivational tales that explore themes of love, unity, and patriotism. Stay with us always for interesting stories. Thanks. Let's start the story. The downtown bank stood like a symbol of power and prestige, its grand white columns gleaming under the midday sun. Inside, the atmosphere was just as imposing, with polished marble floors and an air of exclusivity that seemed to linger in every corner. Clients moved about with quiet confidence, their wealth and status reflected in their tailored suits and carefully chosen words. Amelia Johnson stepped through the glass doors, her sharp, tailored suit and leather briefcase setting her apart. She walked with the kind of poise that turned heads, her calm confidence quietly commanding attention. The staff and a few clients glanced in her direction, some with curiosity, others with unspoken judgment. She approached the counter, her expression composed and her tone polite but firm as she handed over her check. The cashier froze for a brief moment, her eyes widening slightly at the amount on the paper. It was an unusually large sum, one that required managerial approval. "One moment, ma'am," the cashier said, her voice low. "I'll need to call our manager to process this." Amelia nodded, her face betraying no emotion, as she waited. Behind a tall oak door marked manager, Thomas Caldwell glanced up from his desk as the cashier stepped inside. He was a man who wore his authority with an air of entitlement, his sharp suit and practiced smile masking an ingrained disdain for anyone who didn't fit his narrow definition of worthy. His reputation among the staff was well known, efficient, yes, but cold and dismissive, especially toward those he perceived as beneath him. The cashier hesitated, her tone nervous. "Mr. Caldwell, there's a client with a significant check that requires your approval." Thomas set down his pen, his expression hardening slightly. "Send her in," he said, his voice clipped. As the cashier left, he leaned back in his chair, already forming judgments about the person he was about to meet. When Amelia stepped into the office, her confidence unshaken, Thomas's eyes narrowed almost imperceptibly. He masked it quickly, but the faint undercurrent of disdain in his tone was unmistakable. "How can I help you?" he asked curtly, barely glancing at the check she placed before him. The staff outside exchanged uneasy glances, sensing the shift in the air as tension began to build. Amelia handed her check to the cashier, Lisa, who froze momentarily as her eyes scanned the paper. The amount was staggering, far above what she typically processed. For a moment, Lisa glanced up at Amelia, her expression a mix of surprise and unease. "One moment, ma'am," Lisa said, her voice betraying a slight tremor. "I'll need to have our manager approve this." Amelia offered a polite nod, her face calm and unreadable. Lisa excused herself and walked briskly toward the manager's office, her grip on the check tightening as she rehearsed her words in her head. She knew Mr. Caldwell's reputation all too well. Meticulous to a fault, often overly suspicious, and quick to impose his authority. Inside the office, Thomas barely looked up from his desk as Lisa entered. "There's a client at the counter with a check that requires your approval," she explained, holding out the paper. He took it without a word, his eyes scanning the details before his lips tightened into a faint, skeptical line. "Send her in," he said curtly, waving Lisa away. Moments later, Amelia stepped into the office. Her presence filled the room, her confident posture and poised demeanor contrasting sharply with Thomas's guarded expression. She placed her briefcase on the chair beside her and met his gaze evenly. "Good morning," she began. "I'm here to deposit this check into my account." Thomas picked up the check again, his eyes narrowing slightly. "This is quite a large amount," he muttered, almost to himself. "Where did these funds originate?" Amelia tilted her head slightly, her voice steady as she replied, "All the necessary documentation is attached. You'll see that the funds are legitimate and properly accounted for. If you need confirmation, my legal team's contact information is provided." He glanced at the documents, but his skepticism didn't waver. "Even so, transactions like this require additional verification. I'll need to delay processing until everything checks out." Amelia's brow furrowed slightly, though her voice remained calm. "I'm not sure what else you need, Mr. Caldwell. Everything is in order and your team has processed similar transactions for my account before. This should be no difference." Thomas leaned back in his chair, his tone sharpening. "It's my job to ensure everything is done by the book, Miss Johnson. Sums like this are not typical for clients like you." The weight of his words hung in the air, and for a moment, Amelia's steady gaze locked with his. She knew exactly what he meant, but she refused to let his veiled bias rattle her. "Clients like me?" she repeated softly, her tone measured. "I'd like you to clarify what you mean by that." Thomas stiffened, realizing his slip, but too defensive to backtrack. "I'm simply saying that this amount raises certain flags. You can't expect me to approve this without further investigation." Amelia leaned forward slightly, folding her hands on the desk. "What I expect, Mr. Caldwell, is for my transaction to be handled with the same professionalism and respect afforded to every other client. Now, if there's a legitimate issue with my account, please state it." The tension in the room grew palpable as the two faced off. Outside, Lisa glanced nervously at her co-workers, sensing that things inside were escalating quickly. Lisa hesitated near the office door, her nerves mounting as she overheard the increasingly tense exchange. She knew Amelia's reputation. This wasn't the first time she'd processed a significant transaction for her. Gathering her courage, Lisa knocked lightly and stepped inside. "Mr. Caldwell," she began cautiously, If I may, I recognized Miss Johnson. She's a long-standing client of the bank and has conducted similar transactions in the past without issue. Her account is in excellent standing." Thomas barely glanced at her, his tone curt and dismissive. "Thank you, Lisa, but I'll handle this." He waved a hand toward the door, signaling her dismissal. "You have other responsibilities to attend to." Lisa opened her mouth to protest, but caught Amelia's subtle shake of the head, urging her not to push further. With a quiet apology, Lisa left the office, her cheeks burning as she returned to her desk. Amelia exhaled slowly, her patience fraying but her demeanor remaining composed. She reached into her briefcase, retrieving her phone. "If this can't be resolved here, I'll escalate it," she said evenly. Without waiting for a response, she began dialing. Thomas leaned forward, his jaw tightening. "Who exactly are you calling?" he asked, his voice strained. "The bank's leadership team," Amelia replied without looking up. "If you're unwilling to process my transaction, perhaps they can provide clarity on why this is happening." Thomas's unease was evident now, though he tried to mask it with indifference. "You can call whoever you like," he said stiffly. "They'll tell you the same thing. Protocol must be followed for sums like this." Amelia held his gaze as the phone rang on the other end, her calm demeanor a stark contrast to the tension radiating from Thomas. Outside the office, a few staff members exchanged hushed whispers, their glances darting toward the closed door. A couple of clients in the lobby noticed the commotion. Their curiosity piqued. Thomas, feeling the weight of the growing attention, adjusted his tie and leaned back in his chair. "You need to understand," he said, his voice growing sharper. "I'm simply doing my job. It's standard procedure to verify transactions of this magnitude." Amelia placed the phone down for a moment, meeting his gaze squarely. "Standard procedure doesn't seem to apply equally to all your clients, Mr. Caldwell. If this is truly about protocol, you'll need to explain why every document I've provided isn't sufficient." The tension in the room felt like a taut wire ready to snap. Outside, Lisa exchanged a nervous glance with a coworker, her concern for both Amelia and the situation growing. Meanwhile, Tomas's facade of authority began to falter, though he clung stubbornly to his position. The tension in the office was abruptly interrupted by the sound of the door swinging open. Margaret Ellis, the bank's regional director, strode in with an air of authority, her sharp eyes scanning the room. She took in the scene instantly. Thomas seated stiffly behind his desk, Amelia poised yet visibly displeased, and the palpable tension thick in the air. "Good afternoon," Margaret said, her tone professional but firm. Her gaze shifted to Amelia, and recognition softened her features. "Mrs. Johnson, I wasn't aware you were here today. My apologies for any inconvenience you've experienced." Amelia stood, her demeanor as composed as ever. "Thank you, Margaret. Unfortunately, there's been a misunderstanding regarding a transaction I've attempted to process." She gestured toward Thomas without breaking her polite tone. "Mr. Caldwell has expressed some concerns about my check, despite all proper documentation being provided." Margaret's expression tightened, and she turned to Thomas, her voice steely. "Thomas, care to explain why this transaction hasn't been completed yet? Thomas straightened in his chair, his usual air of confidence now slightly shaken. It's standard procedure, he began, fumbling for words. For amounts like this, we're required to perform additional verifications. I was just ensuring everything is in order. Margaret's eyes narrowed. Standard procedure? With documentation this thorough and a client of Miss Johnson's caliber? Tell me, Thomas, is this level of scrutiny applied to every client who walks through that door? Thomas's response came slower this time, his words defensive. It's about ensuring the integrity of the process. I'm only doing my job. Margaret didn't flinch. She stepped closer, her gaze sharp. Integrity or selective judgment? Let me remind you, Thomas, that our responsibility as a bank is to serve every client with respect and professionalism, something you've clearly failed to do today. Turning back to Amelia, Margaret's voice softened. Miss Johnson, I assure you this matter will be resolved immediately, and I deeply regret the way you've been treated. Thank you, Margaret, Amelia replied, her tone steady but deliberate. I trust this will be addressed appropriately. Margaret nodded before glancing back at Thomas. Her next words landed like a hammer. Thomas, do you even know who Miss Johnson is? When he remained silent, she continued, her tone icy. She is the largest shareholder of this bank. She holds a controlling stake in this institution. The very branch you manage exists in part because of her investments. The color drained from Thomas's face, his confidence crumbling as the weight of her words sank in. I wasn't aware, he stammered, his voice barely above a whisper. You should have been, Margaret snapped. Your ignorance is bad enough, but your conduct today goes beyond negligence. It's unprofessional, it's biased, and it's unacceptable. Thomas opened his mouth as if to defend himself, but quickly closed it, realizing there was nothing he could say to undo the damage. Margaret's piercing gaze lingered on him for a moment before she turned back to Amelia. Miss Johnson, I'll personally ensure your transaction is processed without further delay, Margaret said. Then I'll be reviewing Mr. Caldwell's actions with the leadership team immediately. Amelia nodded, gathering her briefcase. I appreciate that, Margaret. I hope this serves as a reminder that professionalism should never be conditional. As she exited the office, Margaret remained behind, her expression grim as she turned her full attention back to Thomas. You've made a grave error today, Thomas, she said, and rest assured, there will be consequences. Thomas sat frozen in his chair, his face pale as Margaret's words echoed in his mind. The reality of the situation hit him like a tidal wave. He had not only insulted a valued client, but also disrespected the largest shareholder of the bank. His hands fidgeted with a pen, his usual confident demeanor replaced by visible panic. Margaret, I didn't mean for this to escalate, Thomas began, his voice shaky. I was simply following protocol. It was never personal. Margaret's expression hardened, cutting him off mid-sentence. Protocol, she repeated, her tone sharp. Is it protocol to dismiss valid documentation? Is it protocol to treat a long-standing client with blatant disrespect? Don't insult my intelligence, Thomas. I was just being cautious, Thomas tried again, his words faltering under her unyielding gaze. It was about ensuring the bank's security. Margaret leaned forward, her voice icy but measured. No, Thomas, it wasn't about caution. It was about bias. You allowed your assumptions to override your professionalism, and in doing so, you jeopardized this bank's reputation. That's negligence, and it's unacceptable. Outside the office, Amelia sat calmly in the lounge, reviewing her documents while sipping a glass of water. She had requested the matter be resolved swiftly, but made it clear to Margaret that such incidents reflected poorly on the institution. "This can't happen again," she had said firmly. "As a stakeholder, I expect professionalism at all levels. Discretion is important, but accountability is non-negotiable." Margaret assured her the situation was being handled. "Your transaction will be completed immediately," she had said, bowing slightly in apology, "and I'll personally see to it that appropriate measures are taken." Back in the office, Thomas watched helplessly as Margaret outlined the next steps. "In the meantime, I expect your full cooperation as we address the damage you've caused." Back in the office, Thomas watched helplessly as we addressed the damage you've caused. Thomas nodded weakly, knowing he had no choice but to comply. His usual confidence was replaced by a gnawing sense of dread as Margaret's words sank deeper. His career, once a symbol of his authority, now hung by a thread. His feverish eyes wandered over the room as a dry eye, not confined by any compressions, but only by the sweeping wing of some natural light that faintly moved with the arc of the moonlight falling upon it. His extremities grew Meanwhile, Margaret returned to Amelia with a composed but apologetic demeanor. "Miss Johnson," she said, "your transaction has been processed without further delay. On behalf of the bank, I sincerely apologize for the unacceptable treatment you experienced today." Amelia stood gracefully, extending a polite but firm nod. "Thank you, Margaret. I trust this will be a turning point for the institution." As she exited the bank, the staff and clients watched her in respectful silence, the gravity of the situation leaving a lingering tension in the air. Margaret, meanwhile, glanced back at the office where Thomas sat, her expression resolute. The fallout from his actions was only beginning. The conference room at the bank's headquarters was abuzz with murmurs as the leadership team assembled. The gravity of the meeting was evident, and all eyes turned toward the head of the table where Amelia Johnson sat, poised and authoritative. Her composed demeanor left no doubt that she was in full control of the situation. "Thank you all for coming on such short notice," Amelia began, her voice calm yet commanding. "Yesterday's incident at one of our branches highlighted that not just an individual failure, but a systemic issue within this organization. As the largest shareholder of this bank, I consider it my responsibility to ensure that we uphold the highest standards of professionalism and respect for every client and employee." The room grew silent, the weight of her words sinking in. Margaret Ellis, seated beside Amelia, nodded in agreement, her expression stern. Across the table, Thomas sat stiffly, avoiding Amelia's gaze. His usual confidence had been replaced by visible discomfort. "This is not just about one incident," Amelia continued. "It's about the culture we've allowed to persist. If we fail to address these issues now, we risk losing the trust of our clients and tarnishing the reputation we've worked so hard to build." She slid a set of documents across the table, outlining her proposed measures. "I'm recommending immediate action on 3 fronts. First, We will implement mandatory training for all staff on inclusion, cultural competence, and unconscious bias. This is non-negotiable and will be an ongoing program. The leadership team exchanged glances, some nodding in agreement while others remained stoic. Second, Amelia continued, we need a comprehensive review of our internal procedures. The goal is to identify and eliminate any practices that enable discrimination, whether intentional or not. Every branch, every policy, every interaction must reflect the values we claim to stand for. Margaret spoke up, her tone firm. I fully support this. Incidents like what happened yesterday cannot be tolerated, and it's clear we need a top-to-bottom evaluation of our practices. Amelia acknowledged Margaret with a slight nod and moved to her final point. Third, we will establish an internal complaint mechanism accessible to both clients and employees. This system will ensure that issues can be reported, addressed, and resolved efficiently without fear of retaliation. The leadership team murmured their agreement, the sense of urgency evident. Thomas shifted in his seat, his discomfort now palpable. He finally spoke, his voice strained. Mrs. Johnson, while I understand the need for changes, I assure you that my actions were not meant to reflect any bias. I was simply... Amelia raised a hand, silencing him with a calm but firm tone. Mr. Caldwell, this is not the time for justifications. Your actions were symptomatic of a larger problem, one that we must address head-on. This is not personal. It's about ensuring the integrity of this institution. Thomas fell silent, his face reddening as the weight of her words pressed down on him. The meeting concluded with unanimous support for Amelia's proposals. As the leadership team began to disperse, Margaret turned to Amelia. This is exactly what we needed, she said. Your leadership is going to set the standard for the future. Amelia nodded, her expression resolute. It's a step forward, but there's still work to be done. Change doesn't happen overnight. It happens through accountability and action. As the team left the room, Thomas lingered behind, his posture stiff and uncertain. Amelia glanced at him briefly but said nothing more, her focus already shifting to the work ahead. For her, this was more than a meeting. It was the start of a movement to redefine the bank's values from the inside out. Later that day, Margaret Ellis called Thomas into her office. The atmosphere was heavy, the tension palpable as he stepped inside. He knew this conversation was inevitable, but it did little to prepare him for the weight of Margaret's expression. She sat behind her desk, a folder in front of her, her fingers interlocked as she regarded him with cold professionalism. Thomas, Margaret began, her voice steady but firm, we've reviewed the events of yesterday, and it's clear that your actions not only jeopardized our relationship with a critical client, but also exposed significant flaws in your judgment and conduct. Thomas opened his mouth to respond, but Margaret raised her hand to silence him. Before you try to justify yourself, let me make something clear. This isn't about one mistake. This is about a pattern of behavior that goes against the principles of respect and fairness that this bank stands for. Thomas shifted uncomfortably, his face flushed. I understand, Margaret, he began hesitantly. But my intent was never to undermine anyone. I was only trying to follow procedure. Procedure? Margaret cut him off, her voice rising slightly. You didn't even review the documents properly. Everything you needed to verify the check was in front of you, and yet you chose to delay the transaction. That wasn't procedure, Thomas. That was bias, and it's unacceptable." Thomas's shoulders slumped as the weight of her words settled over him. "I made a mistake," he admitted quietly. "But surely I can—" Margaret's tone softened, but her resolve remained firm. "Thomas, there is no path forward for you here. You've undermined this bank's reputation and failed to uphold the standards expected of someone in your position." She opened the folder in front of her and slid a paper across the desk. "You have two options. You can submit your resignation today, and we'll provide you with a neutral letter of recommendation. Or, if you choose to stay, you will face an internal investigation that will undoubtedly result in your termination. I strongly advise you to take the first option." Thomas stared at the paper, his hands trembling slightly. He knew he had no choice. The investigation would not only confirm his bias, but also further damage his already crumbling reputation. Slowly, he picked up the pen Margaret handed him and signed his name at the bottom of the resignation letter. Margaret watched him with an expression that was neither sympathetic nor gloating. "I hope you use this as a chance to reflect," she said as she collected the paper. "Your actions have consequences, and I trust you'll carry this lesson with you moving forward." Thomas stood, his face pale and his confidence shattered. Without another word, he left the office, clutching the weight of his decision as he walked away from the career he had once held so proudly. Margaret sighed deeply, closing the folder and turning her thoughts to the road ahead, determined to ensure such a failure would never happen again. A week later, Amelia Johnson returned to the branch, her presence commanding yet approachable, as she stepped through the glass doors. This time, the atmosphere was markedly different. The staff greeted her warmly, their respect and attentiveness evident in every gesture. The tension that had once clouded her previous visit was replaced with a quiet air of accountability and change. Lisa, the young cashier who had tried to intervene, hesitated for a moment before gathering the courage to approach Amelia. "Amelia," Mrs. Johnson, Lisa began, her voice tinged with both humility and regret. "I wanted to apologize. I should have done more to stand up for you that day." Amelia's gaze softened and she gave Lisa a kind smile. "There's no need to apologize, Lisa. I saw your efforts, and they didn't go unnoticed. It takes courage to speak up, even when the circumstances aren't in your favor." Lisa's face flushed with relief and gratitude. "Thank you, Ms. Johnson. That means a lot coming from you." Amelia nodded thoughtfully before continuing. "I believe this bank could use more people like you, people willing to do what's right even in difficult situations. If you're interested, I'd like to discuss opportunities for your growth within the organization. I think you have great potential." Lisa's eyes widened in surprise. I'd be honored," she stammered, her voice filled with emotion. As Amelia made her way through the branch, she took note of the subtle changes already in place. Staff members carried themselves with a renewed sense of purpose, and the atmosphere felt more inclusive and respectful. She knew this was just the beginning, but it was a step in the right direction. Outside, Thomas quietly exited the building for the last time, his head bowed as he walked toward the street. His resignation had been finalized, and his once promising career now lay in ruins. He had learned a harsh lesson about the consequences of his actions, but the knowledge came too late to save his reputation. Amelia paused at the threshold of the branch, glancing back one last time. The building stood not just as a place of business, but as a symbol of transformation, a reminder that change was possible when leadership confronted systemic flaws head-on. With her head held high, she stepped into the sunlight, resolved to continue her mission of fostering accountability and equality within the institutions she had worked so hard to build. For the staff, clients, and community, the branch became a beacon of progress, demonstrating how one incident, handled with integrity and decisive action, could inspire meaningful change. And for Amelia, it was a testament to the power of perseverance, leadership, and the unwavering pursuit of justice. Amelia Johnson's actions stood as a powerful testament to the strength of empowerment and justice. Throughout the ordeal, she remained composed and decisive, refusing to let prejudice or bias define the outcome. Her calm yet firm demeanor dismantled the unspoken assumptions that had clouded the situation, reminding everyone watching that true power comes from integrity and confidence. Thomas Caldwell's downfall became a cautionary tale within the bank's walls. His implicit bias had blinded him to the truth, and his refusal to acknowledge his mistakes led to the collapse of his career. It wasn't just about one bad decision. It was about the systemic consequences of allowing prejudice to fester. His story echoed a universal lesson. Bias, no matter how subtle, can bring even the most seasoned professionals to their knees. Yet, from the ashes of that failure, Amelia saw an opportunity. Using her authority, she transformed the incident into a catalyst for systemic change. Mandatory inclusion training, procedural reviews, and a safe complaint mechanism weren't just policies. They were promises of a better future. Amelia's leadership wasn't about vengeance. It was about ensuring that what happened to her would never happen to anyone else. In the end, the bank didn't just recover, it evolved. The branch became a symbol of progress, a place where lessons were learned and changes were made. For Amelia, it was never just about one incident. It was about the legacy she left behind, a legacy of justice, accountability, and the courage to lead by example. Before you speak or act against someone, think twice. The person standing calmly, speaking kindly without anger or abuse, might be far more powerful and influential than they appear. Never underestimate simplicity. Sometimes, the most unassuming people hold the greatest strength. Comments below where you're watching from, and if you like and love our story, kindly subscribe our channel. Life, inspirational, and motivational tales that explore themes of love, unity, and patriotism. Stay with us always for interesting stories. Thanks.